What was your influences growing up?
Okay, so on my wall, I grew up in the DC area, and I was too young to really engage or be aware of when the Bullets won the title, but it was definitely in the air, right? They had just won the championship previous few years. People thought that they were going to be good for a long time. But to have a poster of Manute Bol and Muggsy Bogues together, that was the biggest poster on my wall.
Okay.
When I was like just a toddler, literally, was when they won the title. And that was young enough that I don't remember it. But the people around me, obviously, when your team in your town wins an NBA title, everyone's like crazy about that team. So I had like a little baby onesie thing that had like bullets across the front, which, you know, now looking back, that's weird, but that's okay. That's what it was. And that like the Bullets were still like a big deal even in those years after they won, right? And it was always, when I was a little kid, it was the promise of like, oh, well, they didn't win that long ago. They won a few years ago, so they'll win again. Kevin, they've never won again. In fact, they've never come close to winning again. And now the team I grew up rooting for doesn't even exist, right? Because it's got a different name. They play in a different state. When I was growing up, they played in Maryland. They don't play in Maryland anymore. Like the colors have changed like 6 times since I was a kid. So it is weird to grow up loving basketball and feel like the team that you loved doesn't exist. I'm not going to relate myself to like Seattle because I feel like those fans are like on a whole different level from anyone in DC. But like it is a little bit of that weird feeling of having this ghost of a team where the team's still there, unlike the Sonics, which they just lost, right? But it's not the team that I grew up with. I mean, the whole thing is just a little bit strange. And now also with the football team, the team I grew up with has a different name, different uniforms. The whole thing is, it's weird to grow up as be a DC sports person and have all that shift, which goes back to my influences. I grew up a huge Georgetown basketball fan too, and that at least has stayed the same.
When the Big East was the Big East.
When the Big East was the Big East, baby. And
it was like a mini NBA.
Yeah, 1,000%. And Big John, like John Thompson. I remember the first time I met him when I was actually working, and I didn't speak. I was so nervous. And, you know, Johnny had spent time with him before he passed. Just an amazing guy. And immediately just kind of called me, you know, he knew. And just, I was just so in awe.
How old were you?
When I met him, I knew I wanted to cover sports from the very beginning. I'm a very small human. I cannot play anything well because I am so tiny. So, I love sports. I love being involved in sports. I love being around sports. And I knew that between being very, very short and a girl, there was no way I was going to have my own act. I never had those dreams. It's not like, there's a lot of people in media who are like, could have been a player. I never could have been a player. There's no illusion here at all. So I just knew I had to find a different way to be around it and be involved in it. So from a very young age, I was like, well, I kind of know how to write. Maybe I'll be a writer. I could be a sports writer. And when I was just a teenager, I started interning. I was an intern at USA Today because in the DC area is where they're based. So I did that. I went to college at Northwestern University in Chicago, and I started stringing for people because I went to college in the 90s when the Bulls, I don't know if you heard, they were really good back then.
Really good.
Yeah. So Michael Jordan's second stint with the Bulls, that second three-peat, you know, I was doing as a college stringer, which means that I would go and I would get like literally, I think, 25 or 30 bucks a story. And I would take the L train to the arena and I would cover the game. And then I would write my little story and I would send it off to different newspapers. And I would get 25 bucks for each newspaper to be their person there. Because that way they wouldn't have to pay to travel someone and do all that stuff. And for me, it was amazing because I was 19 years old and getting to cover Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen and Steve Kerr and all of that stuff. And I think that's where I first learned to sort of speak up for myself and do all of that. And it was a little bit because of Michael, because kind of like with John, I got in the locker room the first time, a few times, even just at the practice facility. And I didn't say anything because, you know, I felt like so out of place, right?
Crazy.
I was just this young person and I just sort of taking my notes. And like maybe the fourth time I was at the Birdo, remember the Birdo Center where the Bulls used to practice? And Michael just, like in the group of, you know, 15 reporters, writers, he was like, he's like, do you speak? And yes. And he goes, well, why aren't you asking questions? You just freeloading here? What are you doing? And I was like, okay. So
Oh, wow.
found my voice, asked my question. And to his credit, and all those guys, I will say, because I've been around teams that were not so welcoming to young women or people who are new, he answered me really thoroughly. And he was like, that's a good question. And ever since like that moment covering that team, that gave me a lot of confidence to just sort of be like, okay, if I'm going to be here, I better show up.